Chapter 4, AP United States History at Notre Dame High School. This is Mr. Shea. In this chapter, we're going to discuss more specifics of daily life and economics as well within the colonies. And we start in the Chesapeake. And with the growth of tobacco, which we're going to talk about in a second, one could kind of be misled and think that life was very good and prosperous. But in fact, just the grind of the daily life, along with disease, Native American attacks, created an extremely unhealthy area for humans to exist. And if you look here at some of the stats, half of the people born in early Virginia and Maryland died before their 20th birthday. Few lived to see their 50th birthday. So this is very difficult life. It talks about the scarcity of women. Not many women came here. It was very expensive to travel. Men traveled alone, looking to establish themselves, looking to establish farms. Many came as indentured servants. So women are, or I should say, men are vastly are undernumbered. I'm sorry. Uh, Men vastly outnumber women, 6 to 1 in the region. So you also don't have a very high fertility rate. Uh, so population growth is really limited to more men and then eventually slaves coming over until we move into the later years. Women who were here, having a child was very difficult because of the conditions. Many would die in childbirth. That would happen anywhere, but especially in this region. And children had a very slight chance of reaching adulthood. So as we move through the early times and you move into the later 17th century, let me just jump ahead here, and we talk about the tobacco economy. John Rolfe is given credit for figuring out how to cultivate it and make it appealing to Europeans. And as it becomes appealing, the demand skyrockets. You look at the last bullet point here, in 1630, 1.5 million pounds of tobacco are shipped, and by the end of the century, 40 million. So it grew at a staggering rate. And as easy as tobacco was to grow and as inexpensive as it was to grow for the farmer, which was a great quality about tobacco, it was equally as hard on the soil. So with that being the case, expansion was always on the minds of Virginia farmers, Maryland farmers, Chesapeake Bay farmers to find more land to push the limits. And that, of course, risked Indian attack. Also, the demand for labor increased. And when you look at Native Americans, they weren't a good labor force due to the fact that they would die off from disease. They would have to be fought with. So indentured servitude became the most popular form of increasing the labor force. When indentured servants came over, whether it was a 7 or 9 year or even 5 year, some of them term, their hope was to eventually have their own land, to farm their own land and make their own way. But for the majority of them, that was not a possibility, and most would end up just continuing to work, and at that point for very low wages. Just an advertisement, early advertisement for tobacco. Not sure if that makes you want to buy tobacco or not, but that was what worked then. Now we do commercials. Some indentured servants did save up enough or have enough resources to stake a claim for their own land. And as time went on, the Virginia established farmers, or the farmer aristocracy, although it wasn't huge, but they didn't want to fight for these new farmers and their expansion, because as new farmers pop up, they want to go further and further into the country so that they can establish themselves. Well, every time you go further, you have to face Indians again. And several of these former indentured servants and new farmers who wanted to expand were frustrated by Governor Berkeley's refusal to send troops and help and aid them with the Indians. They rallied together under Nathaniel Bacon, and Bacon's rebellion takes place in 1676. It really rattled the establishment because it showed an early American spirit or early American revolutionary spirit, and a promise of things to come, because Americans are going to be very apt at rebelling against authority and even in the government role. So Bacon's rebellion was fairly successful. In fact, he pretty much puts Virginia on notice and controls much of Virginia during the rebellion. It doesn't last long because when Bacon passes away, the rebellion is easily suppressed. Okay, so colonial slavery. It starts out very slow because slaves were just too expensive. And, tobacco is not a crop that requires an enormous amount of labor, okay, but it was just too expensive for early Virginians, at least, to import slaves. So, but as time moves on, and we talk about the expansion of the colonies and South Carolina and everything else, it's very quickly apparent that slaves are the labor force that are going to be used primarily in the colonies on the major plantations, on the bigger tobacco plantations in Virginia, and on the big plantations in South Carolina, and then on a much smaller scale at smaller farms across these areas as well. So, what was the Middle Passage like? I'm going to go through with you on a few slides moving forward in a second here. But just remember, slave codes, a lot of those ideas come from um, the Barbados slave code, but it wasn't just the slaves, it was also their children who were going to be born into slavery. To establish and keep slaves from revolting, there were many laws put in place. So here, literacy laws against teaching slaves to read. Many plantations went out of the way to make sure their slaves didn't come into contact with other slaves, fearing they might unite together. And then brutal force is used to make sure that slaves continue to understand what their slave owners wanted them to understand in their place. Discrimination becomes very powerful as opposed to in Africa. And you talk about African slavery, that wasn't the case. It was just debts owed. Discrimination um, became in the or began to evolve in the South, and we know it's going to continue for years to come. I'll skip that letter for now. Okay, so the Middle Passage, how does it start? It started with African tribes who were trading with Europeans. Sometimes it was the Portuguese. The Portuguese still controlled much of the west coast of Africa and headed up the slave trade there. They would make deals, and you see in this picture, uh, you have guns in the picture, and oftentimes weapons were traded along with valuables, and that these tribes would round up members of other tribes and sell them or trade them to the Portuguese slave traders. At that point, they would make their voyages, okay, and wherever they ended up, okay. But we're focusing on America here, the West Indies, and you see the numbers 4.8 million, and from here they are put on auction blocks. Let's see if I have a picture of that. Well, let me go to the ships first. So this is the voyage. It's the Middle Passage. So here you are again. Imagine you're in Africa. You have a family. You're living your ordinary life. You're a farmer. You are simply knocked over the head or held at gunpoint, and you know what's going on, that you're being captured for slavery. Now you're transported to the shores where you're put onto a boat. They're extremely brutal when you're first put onto the boat. They'll shoot anybody who tries to cause any problems. Rape is very common for women who are being transported on these ships. Pregnant women are transported on these ships. Pregnant women give birth on these ships. Suicide rates are very high in the ships, so the Africans will jump off. If they are boarded for illegal slave trading, they will dump the slaves. I mean, simply drown them. So the Middle Passage itself, just across the ocean, is horribly brutal. Just gives you an idea how crowded these ships were. Shoulder to shoulder, head to toe. No room was spared. And eventually, if somebody got sick, they would only feed those who were not sick to make sure that they made it. Just another painting just showing how tight quartered it was and how miserable it must have been. Okay, once here in the New World, or in America, where the slave ended up determined quite a bit the type of life that slave was going to have. If you were a slave and you ended up in the deepest South, it was very tough. It was hot, brutal temperatures. You worked longer years, because the months were long. You worked 10, 11 months in the planting season. It was brutal to go out in the hot sun every day and perform your duties. So it was much more likely that you would not live as long as a slave may have lived if he or she were in the North. One thing that was a side plot to that, I guess, would be that the Africans in this area were able to hold on to their cultures more because they were isolated, such large plantations. They only had each other to really interact with and communicate with. So you see a little bit more of African culture preserved in these larger plantations. If you were in the tobacco growing Chesapeake, life was a little bit easier. There was the plantations themselves. Well, I should say the work itself was not as challenging. The season was not as long, and there was more interaction with white America. Okay, what really grows the slave population so fast as we move into the 18th century is the slaves themselves. Their fertility rate was very high, reproduction. And remember, every slave born into slavery, every baby born into slavery would be a slave. So that contributed to immense slave growth in these regions. Black culture that came out of this, or slave culture, the language of Gula, um, but also the contributions, and you could read more in your book about the infrastructure of the South, and it was limited. There weren't huge cities, but most of it is built by slaves during this time. There were some slave revolts. Nat Turner's revolt was especially brutal, um, which you could understand. And after any revolt, slave laws would become more severe in that area because the slave owners feared so much that they were outnumbered that this could take place. Hangings and murder and torture or beatings, anyway, I should say, were very common after a failed slave revolt just to scare the slaves away from trying that again. And just some pictures here again. You see the American flag is depicted in the right on the top of the building, 1830. Here's just list of Price Carolina Gazette. You can see slaves listed on the right side to be sold. This man was an example. I can't remember his name now, but he's 100 years old in this picture, this portrait. He was able to actually buy his freedom. I believe he resided in Georgia. Just illustrating slave culture. And this would be Charleston. You see a very successful, large harbor, definitely a place where the slave trade excelled. So, Southern society, Southern society really does grow into an aristocratic society. Not so much nobles and lords like Old England, but aristocratic. You had the very wealthy planting class, the plantation owners, the massive plantation owners, the very wealthies, the Fitzhughes, Lees, Washingtons. They are the extreme wealthy, and then under them, and they worked hard and they built their plantations up. They'd probably worked the soil, but they were far above the average farmer. The average planter had a smaller farm, maybe could afford a slave or two, uh, just make enough to get by from year to year. Below them would be landless whites. For them, that was if you didn't have land, you were looking for work, and it was not impossible to find work because there were enough small farms that couldn't afford slaves, but it was challenging to find work, and the pay was very little, and the work was very challenging. And then indenturers, and those are your poorest whites who are working off a debt or are working for the promise of land someday. Not too many cities. We mentioned Charlestown, but for the most part, Southern life is built around farms. You also don't see education as being a major role here, probably because religion wasn't out either. It was focused on farming and agriculture. Okay, in New England, things are extremely different. Just look at some of the points here. The first generations of Puritans averaged 70 years old. So they were living much longer lives. They didn't migrate to America as just men, as indentured servants. They migrated as families. They came here with the idea of starting a brand new life, whereas many in the Chesapeake came here with the idea of starting a farm, making money, and then bringing their family over or going back to England. In New England, the population that migrates are family centered, very different. The population of England grows by staggering rates just based on reproduction. The average woman is going to be pregnant several times during her lifetime, maybe 7 to 10 times. She's probably going to give birth 6 to 8 times. Lose some of the children. But even having birth, as the slide points out, which I was going to mention, is very difficult. Again, challenging. Many die during childbirth. But women are expected to be childbearers, and they're expected to have a lot of kids. Other things that were contrasting, you talk about women and women's rights. The Southern women probably had more rights because there were so few of them. When husbands would die, women were allowed to inherit land. If a woman died in New England, a man died in New England, the wife was not the inheritor. It would be a brother-in-law or a brother, who would inherit and control the estate, and the woman would just live on the estate, or maybe they'd be taken care of. In the South, women had a little bit more economic freedom. Did women gain excessive rights? No. They still couldn't vote. In New England, again, they couldn't own rights. They couldn't own land for the most part. One of the ways that women really gained a foothold in New England, especially, was through education, and within the household. So their influence grew through that house, and really Abigail Adams and are going to be examples. We talk about Republican motherhood eventually, where we could really see that influence in everyday society. If you had a problem with your marriage, you were expected to stick it out. Death was one way out. Adultery would get an annulment from the church. But for the most part, if you're having problems in your marriage in New England, you're expected to stay together. This illustrates the close family tightness, mother-child. This picture is supposed to represent a 100-year-old woman who I believe had 8 to 10 children, something like that. Okay. So New England, when you think about life in New England towns, we talked about this in class today, how it was structured around the green, the church, Main Street, smaller farms behind the homes, a community built around the church with a purpose in mind. Education, especially elementary education, extremely important in New England towns, again, because it's built around the church. The idea of being able to read scripture was very important. 1636 is Harvard is founded. When we think about colonial government, whether it was a Massachusetts Assembly or even town meetings in these early towns, they're already discussing who's going to be schoolmaster. Okay, that's today's principal. Who are going to be elected officials? What are you going to do about roads that need repair? These are things that we still see today. As we mentioned, New England towns today have held on to their love of smaller government. And these meetings still take place today in your towns, whether your parents are going to a meeting about what they're going to do and change in a curriculum within a school system, or a new program that's going to be offered, who's going to be hired as a principal. All this stuff still goes on today. So what's going on with religion? Well, one thing, let me just see here. I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll talk about the Salem witch trials and the halfway covenant. Okay. Many begin in New England to stray away from the earliest settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the second generations, where there's not as many conversions. Remember, the conversions are when people see a visible sign from God, and they go to their religious leaders to confirm that it was a conversion, and they are now a visible saint. They are welcome into the Puritan church fully. There are less and less conversions happening as individuals in New England although still grounded in the church, although still grounded in the morals of the church, begin to also focus on advancing themselves financially or in land or things like that. So the church membership is beginning to dwindle. The church charges a tax. They need to raise money in order to continue, so they come up with the halfway covenant. The halfway covenant uh, basically allows is an enormous growth in church membership because now you don't have to be converted to participate. You can participate in the church. You can participate in the Lord's Supper. If you are halfway covenant, if that's how your membership began in the church, your children can now be baptized in the church. That couldn't be done unless you were a visible saint prior to the halfway covenant in 1662. So you have an enormous growth during this time period in church membership, which is surprising because we're talking about Puritan New England, but the actual numbers grew as a result of allowing more into the church, and women now are the majority in the church as a result. Salem witch trials. Let me just sum this up in a brief way, and we'll skip ahead here. The Salem witch trials are nothing new. There were witch trials in Old England as well. It was a witch hunt. It was based on there were political motives, there were economic motives behind it, and essentially, if you were accused of being a witch, the only way to be exonerated is to accuse somebody else or prove your case, which was much harder than just to accuse somebody else, which sounds ridiculous, but that was the truth of the Salem witch trials. It got out of control. As you can see, many were killed. Okay, as a result of the Salem witch trials, which just started with really a few girls. You know, we're going to do a lesson on it. We'll talk in more detail. Eventually, the Salem witch trials just come to an end, but again, they weren't anything new. They did happen in Old England. This book is supposed to illustrate, again, focus on education in the colonies. This is supposed to illustrate the person here in the middle is observing these individuals. It's supposed to be like a witch hunter for any abnormal activity, any sign of, you know, evil animal-like movements or speech, things like that. So in New England, you know, it says there's largely written by rocks. If you ever dug in New England soil, and I have dug installing a fence around my house, dug quite a few holes, you will know that it is very likely that when you start digging into the soil, you are going to hit lots and lots and lots of rocks. Drive around a lot of old towns in New England, in Connecticut. Drive around most towns, and you're going to see a lot of stone walls. Stone walls are everywhere. Why? The rocky soil. What are you going to do with all the rocks? Might as well build a wall. If you drive around in Florida, you're not going to see too many stone walls, and if you do, it's going to be a lot more money. So stones are a problem for farming. It makes farming much more difficult. It makes it harder to cultivate the land, especially in any really on any mass scale. In addition, the climate. Everybody's heard the term. If you don't like the weather in New England, just wait a month, and it's going to change. Well, that's the case. So New England has become extremely adaptive to weather patterns and weather changing. You know, from the cold winters to the hot summers, understanding the patterns of planting. They become very efficient fishermen. Shipbuilding becomes an important trade, and you also have other trades that sprout up as really like carpentry, that and not too soon after more white collar jobs like attorneys and things like that. All right, let's just move on here a little bit. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but let's go back into this here. The cycles of the season, the sunset schedule of the earliest Americans. Okay, and what it's just kind of summing everything up here together. That the earliest or majority of farmers, you don't see really extravagant living anywhere in the colonies, except for in the southern colonies with the major plantations. You do see it there, but for the most part, New England and most of the middle colonies, you really have a sense of humble households, but very comfortable because there are so many resources available. In New York, you do see some English Immigrants try to establish the old world, like noble society. It just never really gets off the ground because the wilderness is there, the opportunity is there, the dangers are there, and America, throughout its colonies, has a democratic feel to them. And there you go, Leicesters Rebellion, New York, and that's really, an attempt there by lordly landholders, and lordly landholders were very popular in England, but not in America. They're never really able to get off the ground here. This is a depressing picture that's supposed to illustrate the natural progression from the cradle to the grave. Okay. All right, that's it for chapter 4. Hope it helps, and good luck on the quiz.